live? Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Well, thank you all for being here this morning to our redistricting breakfast. I am John Fierro. I have the honor of serving as the chair of the Government Relations Committee for the Kansas City Public Schools. I am a elected official representing Subdistrict 3. Before we get started, I want to recognize, obviously, our fearless leader, Dr. Mark Bedell, who's our superintendent. Thank you, Dr. Bedell, for being here. I also want to recognize and introduce our school board, and I'll start with our second fearless leader, and that is Melissa Robinson, who's the board chair. And then we have Patty Manzer, who's our vice chair. Patty, please stand. Not able to join us this morning is Matthew Oates. Matthew serves as our board treasurer. Also, we have this morning my colleague Jennifer Woofsey. Jennifer chairs the communications committee, and I want to give her a special round of applause for helping to organize this particular event. Thank you, Jennifer. And my other colleagues that weren't able to join us include Dr. Amy Hartsfeld, Asia Morris, Carl Evans, Natalie Lewis, and I think that's it. So there's 9 of us. And so we're here to discuss the redistricting process. In the state of Missouri, for those municipalities where there's a total population of 300,000 and more, the Redistricting Commission falls upon the responsibility of the election board, the local election board. So here in Kansas City, the Kansas City Election Board serves as the Redistricting Commission. And because of a piece of legislation passed in 2013, they are required to go through a redistricting process to prepare for the April 2019 election. At that time, we will reduce the board, or the board will be reduced. Currently, we have 9 board members, 3 that serve as at-large members, and 6 who represent sub-districts. In April of 2019, the voters, each of you, will be asked to vote for 7 new board members. We will have 2 at-large members and 5 sub-district members. And so this morning, we're going to discuss the process. But before we do that, I just want to kind of set the stage of where we are with regards to the district and in particular our government relations and communications. Some of you were here earlier in the year when we had a breakfast focused on the legislative priorities of the Kansas City Public Schools. And we appealed to each of you asking for your help and to join us. And I just want to share an example, and I want to set it up with a quotation because I think it's appropriate as to what occurred following that particular breakfast and what I'm hoping will occur after this morning. And the quote goes like this: "When one neighbor helps another, we strengthen our communities." Each of us in this room are neighbors, and it's all about the same thing, and that is improving public education for our families, all of our families. And I just want to say that when you think about redistricting, certainly the issue of power, representation, equity come to mind. And I will tell you, just like all of my colleagues, whatever networks we run in, the typical question is, so how's the school board? How is it working on the school board and working at the Kansas City Public Schools? And I always say the same thing, and that is we have a tremendous leader in Dr. Bedell. This individual is smart, passionate, and is very humble. And then the second thing I always tell people, and that is each of our board members are committed, they're culturally competent, and focused on what's best for the families of our school district. And so while it's a lot of work, it's meaningful. And I would just say that going forward, to maintain that level of support, we need to focus on this redistricting process. This is very important because what you see in the 9 individuals that currently support the policy making, holding our superintendent accountable, that is a result of each of you caring enough to go out and vote and to vote for each of us. So I just wanted to point that out. This morning, we are joined by the 3 consultants that have been hired by the Kansas City Election Board to manage this process. And keep in mind that once we complete the 2020 census, we'll be back at this one more time. So that's probably going to be here in the next 3 years. So it's going to be a quick turnaround. These individuals include Melissa Hasley, who's to my left, Matt Dameron, and Eddie Grime. And so they are going to talk to you about the process and what's ahead. I will point out to them, just like I did the other night at the public board meeting, I'd like for them to respond to 3 questions that I think are appropriate to kind of set you forward in getting input or giving input this morning. The first is, please describe the role of both the Board of Election as well as each of you in this redistricting process. And second, what input are we seeking from the general public? What is it that we need from you all this morning? And then finally, what are the key milestones that they're trying to achieve? So once again, on behalf of my colleagues, our chair, Melissa Robinson, thank you for being here this morning, giving of your time, and we greatly appreciate your partnership and support of all of our children and families attending the Kansas City Public Schools. So with that, I will turn it over to Eddie.
Thank you, John, very much for that introduction. It's good to see many of you again this morning after our meeting a few nights ago. I will address both of the questions. I think there's even a third question or a sub-question in there. I'll make sure I do that as I walk through this. It's helpful today to actually have a printout of the maps. And so what I'll do, I think the temptation is that rather than hear my boring description of the process, I'm sure you're all wanting to just look at the maps while I'm talking. Go ahead and do that, but I'll also try to help you kind of understand how these maps were drawn and kind of the system that we used in preparing these. So let me start with something. Try to imagine somebody comes to you and says, I've got to redo the districts, for an area, come up with maps. And for me, that's actually presents a little bit of a challenge. What I'm used to doing is litigating lawsuits over what maps should look like. But what's easy about that is you already have the map. You've got the map that somebody's challenging, and then usually the challenger says, well, my map is better. And all you have to do is just compare those maps. But what's interesting here is we're starting, with nothing other than our current districts. And so the initial challenge for us is, how do we come up with proposals that cover enough, different possibilities that it conceivably encompasses what the public would want. But we can't come up with so many that public comments are so scattered that we actually can't tell what the sense of the public is. And so you've got to find sort of a sweet spot between having possibilities and making sure you've covered the possibilities, but then also not giving so many that it's just hard to ever start the process of winnowing down the maps. And so that's what we tried to do. Now, an important point I want to make at the outset is we are not here to recommend a map. We're not here to recommend a map. We're here just to kind of help manage the process to come up with maps that ultimately the Board of Elections is going to choose. Now, not always, in fact, this is kind of a rare circumstance where the election authority itself chooses the map. What usually happens with the state legislative districts and congressional districts is that either our General Assembly in Jeff City or committees that are set up and that are, in theory, somewhat politically accountable, they're the ones that do it. And the insight behind doing it that way is that, in large part, this is a political decision. This is a political decision. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but the factors that go into drawing a map are many. And the weight that's placed on each factor can vary probably from person to person, from voter to voter. And ultimately, it's left to our democratic process, ordinarily, to weigh those political factors. But Missouri law says that in this case, we're going to trust our Board of Elections, appointed by different governors over time. We're going to have that entity go ahead and approve the map. And so what we're doing in this process here is we are taking in the political input that ordinarily the General Assembly would take into account when it drafts the new maps every 10 years. So that's a little bit of a background of what we're doing. Now, what did the three of us do, and what was our role? Well, we first met, I think, in late January, and of course I had all these dates the other night. I'm just going to estimate now. Met in late January. We then set up a meeting with a man named Steve Lebowski. He is in the the planning department, and he's sort of the map man. He has all the census data that and the software, which is even more important, to draw these maps and try to equalize the population, and to have the population and ethnicity data that you will see on each map. Now, preparing these maps is not an easy thing. I don't sit down at the computer, type in a few things, and it spits out a map. You can just sit and rattle these off for us even while we're in a meeting. It doesn't work that way. He's got quite a bit to do, and so we will give him our instructions at a meeting, and we did this in our first meeting after we learned about the kind of data he had. And then, some weeks later, he would produce to us the maps we had asked for. So that's kind of how it works. It's not a real-time deal where we all get to sit at a monitor and adjust lines. That's what I was hoping for. It can't happen that way. So we did that, and we had a second meeting after we got all the maps back. And we all got together at City Hall in a room, and we looked through those, and we said, okay, well, we'll want maybe a second round. We excluded a couple that we thought, that's not going to work, and then we asked for more. We had another meeting ourselves to talk about those, and then we finally whittled this down to what you see here today. Now, let me go back to the question I started with. How do you come up with a series of maps in a neutral way? So there's always a risk that if you start off with some sort of non-neutral criteria, then that's going to infect the rest of the process. And, maybe there are no criteria that are totally neutral. But what we said is, it makes sense to start off, because we're going to be losing a district, and that's why we're doing this, because we're losing a district. Let's just do 6 maps, and in each one of the 6, we will remove one district. And then we'll just meld the other districts together, keeping with equal population, which we have to do. And so we did that. We did that process. And as you look at every map, if you could everyone take a look at the one that says start with 6, remove 1. You will see that there are heavy blue lines on the map. And those heavy blue lines are the existing districts. Those are the existing districts. And then you'll see that there is a label at the very bottom. And on the very first page it says, start with 6, remove 1. And so what that means is we're taking out the old first district. We're taking out the old first district. And the old first district is the one that I think it's where my thumb is, if you can all see. It's got 3 different districts all kind of meet together in the heart of the old first. And then the other districts we tried to move as little as possible. Start with 6 kind of refers to where we started as we rotated from after we removed the first one and tried to pull these together. So this is Steve Lebofsky's handiwork, and we didn't go in and make any adjustments. We didn't move a precinct from one thing to the other. And this is one of the ones we thought was worthy of presenting. And the same thing happens throughout. Now, I want to point out to you that if you'll see the second page, which is start with 4 and remove 2, the third page, which is start with 3 and remove 5. Actually, we'll keep it to those 3. Those are all 3 distinct maps from the initial phase. The fourth one, start with 1, remove 6, seemed interesting to us, and so we told Mr. Lebofsky, go back and make a couple more variations on that one. And so behind that, you'll see something that says alternative 9 and alternative 8. So those are variations on the one that says start with 1, remove 6. They're sort of a family. They're sort of a family of maps. And that's one way to do this. I mean, if we had years to do this, we could come up with 4 or 5 families of maps, and then within each family there's a few different variations, and we could go through the process over and over and over again. Of course, we don't do that here because we're going to have to do this all over again after we get the 2020 census data. So this is sort of a stopgap this time around. At any rate, that's one way to look at these. And you would probably eventually notice if you spend a long time and spread these all out on the table, which is a nice way to do it when you go home if you really want to peruse these, spread them all out and kind of walk back and forth. You'll see that the 3 in the back are more similar. So at any rate, it is up to the election board to make a decision here. Let me talk for a second about the factors that would be considered by the election board and that I just suggest to you that you consider. So there are some factors that the law requires. They are in the law. They are non-negotiable. And somebody would come and sue us probably if we violated those. So one of those is equal population. And that derives from a constitutional principle, 1 man, 1 vote. That goes back to the 1960s. We actually didn't have it before then, believe it or not. Now, at the federal level, it's got to be almost exact. But for these districts, it doesn't have to be as exact, but we try to do it anyway. We try to keep it relatively equal. So that's the first one, equality population. Next is compactness. That comes from our Missouri Constitution for other districts, and the statute uses that again. Compactness has no measure. Statisticians have come up with many different tests to try to, measure the area and measure the farthest points. Basically, is it pretty close to like a circle or a square or a pentagon? Is it not sprawling all over the place? Now, I know what many of you are going to say. The one that's pink in every one of these maps looks maybe like it's not compact, but I'll tell you, under Missouri law, compactness is a pretty loose standard. It's got to be less compact than this to not pass legal muster. But nonetheless, it's something. And, compactness, that stands in. That's sort of a neutral way to describe the idea that we want people to kind of know when they're in the district. We want something common about the districts if they're going to be electing somebody to come represent them on the school board. Contiguity is another factor. So you don't want to take a piece from the Northeast and connect it with a piece, along state line in the Southwest. They've got to be all connected. It's the same basic idea that's behind compactness. And it's one way to stop gerrymandering, which we've all heard about a lot lately. Contiguity is supposed to stop that. The final point that we have to think about, but I don't think is going to be impacted here, is the Voting Rights Act. And the basic thing to consider from the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act is we cannot use race as the predominant factor in drawing our districts. We can consider it. It can be considered. I mean, you can see we've got data on every map, but you cannot use race as the predominant factor. So anyway, that's what I'll go ahead. Go. Well, and that's an interesting point. In many communities, obviously, people live, and we could probably have an entire conversation here and afterwards. People live that they've for a lot of reasons that are well known in Kansas City. They live in certain areas based on race, and so it's going to be inevitable that when you draw districts, and this will be true of city council districts, this will be true of the current districts that we have even today, if you were to get data on those, that you will see high proportions of one race or another in certain districts. And if you're trying to kind of follow the idea of compactness, contiguity, you will have that. Now, you could make it a goal and say, all right, we know where the patterns of where people living are, so we're going to make it our goal here to try to draw districts not based on communities or other factors or where people go to school. We are going to make a conscious effort to have relatively equal distributions of race across each district to the extent we can. Now, the only thing I would say is if you make that your number one factor, then you actually have a problem again because you've used race as your primary factor. So look, redistricting can get very difficult if you try to come in with one principle and draw your maps just based on that principle. Invariably, you run into another issue over here. So that's the way it works. But anyway, you'll see there are variations in this map, and those kind of comments are comments that would be useful to get. I mean, it's not just a legal issue, it is a political issue in the sense that people might say, we want it that way. We want to have districts that are more mixed racially. So that's a preference that can be taken into account.
Sir, you say that. Quick before you ask your question, I'm going to get you a microphone because we're on TV. Not because
Here,
we
I'll
can't
give you,
hear you, but just.
I'll give you mine.
If you assert that the map cannot use race, the maps cannot use race in drawing up the boundary lines, they cannot be the predominant. Race cannot be the predominant factor. Mm-hmm. What, in your opinion, was the predominant factor with these lines being drawn?
Well, there is no predominant factor. There is no predominant factor. I mean, and it's going to be rare that there is in redistricting. Now, I would say this, at the state level, there's another column we always have. It's Republican or Democrat, right? And that's what we have a Supreme Court case on right now, is to what extent, I mean, actually it can be considered, but at what point do you cross the line and then you say we have partisan gerrymandering? But I'm sorry, everybody, I'm taking us far afield from our main thing. I'll take another question, then I'll get through to the end, and then maybe we can take more after that.
I appreciate all you've done here, but what I see looks to me rather unimaginative. You've just eliminated a district and moved some lines around, and predominant in every one is the racial divide of Troost. And it's been our history forever, and all we're doing is perpetuating that. Is there a reason that you can't think outside the box and draw lines from east to west so that we have, starting over here on the west, and it goes to the east, and it goes, if you look at sub-district number 3, it basically does that. But everything else is divided sort of, number 1 always has been white, number 2 is mostly white because of Troost. Why can't we think outside the box and do away with that line?
But no, and that's the kind of comment we're trying to solicit here. I don't think, is this on? Yeah, it is. Again, we are not recommending maps for the group here. What we're trying to do, in fact, is sort of self-consciously not impose our own views on this, because that's not our job. Our job is to give you possibilities and then take comment. And if the comments from the public are, you know what, our priority needs to be we cross Troost, or whatever else it is, then we can take that back. Now that begins to narrow a little bit our other options, but you might say, fine, it's time to do this. Narrow the other options. follow the law on compactness, contiguity, race can be a predominant factor, but we want to see truce crossed. And that's exactly why we're having meetings like this, to get those kind of comments. So that's what we should be doing. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is, just to give you an idea, maybe we're already there actually, the comments are sort of making it patent, but there's a whole range of political factors that the community has to give us, and they're all permissible. And so it's permissible even to think about, well, where do incumbents and candidates live in drawing districts? You actually can think about that. That can be a possibility. You know, where are the high schools? Where are the middle schools? You know, where are the sort of communities of interest? You can think about that too. Those are all permissible. You know, where do we want to create a community of interest? I mean, you could do that. We want to create a new community of interest. We want to bring some groups together and give them a representative. Those are all open.
I would actually kind of argue the opposite, because we don't want to leave the east side of town without a voice, without representation. So if you go across Truce, east-west, while that's awesome for schools and for the conversations about integration, we want to make sure that the communities east of Truce have representation and are not overtaken by the communities west of Truce. That would be my observation.
Well, and you know, I don't think the thought here is to moderate. I mean, I suppose I could. We could do that. I meant to just give a report, but you know, we could do this, and I almost defer to the organizers to see what they want us to do. Go ahead, and we'll come back. Here, I'll give you mine, and then I'll take it. We can just cut it. Oh, you've got it already.
Yeah.
All right, well, you can go, and then you can go.
Could you clarify your comment about the Voting Rights Act? I thought you said it's not relevant here, because Voting Rights Act does say things about packing and cracking and, you know, breaking up populations or putting them all in one. So what was your comment about that?
It does apply. In fact, I'm not saying it doesn't. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. No, it does apply. My point is that we don't have any maps here where we are right up against the Voting Rights Act, and that's going to be the thing that we have to look at to decide whether we do a map or not. But it does come into play. There is a case, if anybody is interested in this, there's a school district over on the St. Louis side. 2 years ago, they litigated a Voting Rights Act challenge to school district, sub-district boundaries. And so, and if you go, I mean, it's quite long, and there's detailed findings about, you know, the past elections, and there's a series of factors. And
Excuse me, Eddie.
Yeah.
Let me just say one thing, and then you can finish your story.
Yeah.
What I'd like you to do, please, because we didn't anticipate this conversation would go on, but it's really great, so keep it going. There are note cards on your tables, so comments that you're making about particular maps, things that you like and dislike, please capture those on the comment cards. And there are 3 pieces of information that we'd like from you on that comment card. If you are here affiliated with an organization, please tell us what that organization is. If you are here just as an individual concerned citizen, please tell us your zip code. And if you have a child that attends a KCPS public school, please let us know that. Okay? So those are the 3 pieces of information we want to capture about you. What organization you represent, your zip code if you're here as just a person, and then whether or not you have a child that attends a KCPS school. Then go on, if you wish, and talk about a map that you like, dislike, characteristics of maps that you think should or are represented, and just describe those to us. And each of the maps are labeled. So the first one is start with 6, remove 1. So if your comment is about that one, then put the name of the map on your comment, okay? And you can also submit your comments via email if you prefer. Let's say you go home and you have this with you and you have some more thoughts. You can present your comment via email to kcps-redistricting@kceb.org. So please be sure and get your comments recorded into us.
Can you finish that comment about the Voting Rights Act? I'm sorry. And you said it, what? You were telling the story?
Tell my story. Okay, let me tell you the rest of my story. Once upon a no, anyway, what that case ended up deciding was that the Voting Rights Act was implicated by the districts there, and then I don't know actually where it is now, but they had to go back and redo the districts because of that litigation. So, and once you get to that point, you are really digging deep into data about voting age population, citizenship. You go back to prior elections and you look at a given district to see what the racial breakdown was. And then you say, okay, do we have a history? I think there's 3 factors that then trigger scrutiny, and I'm not going to remember them. So, but one of them is, does the majority population have a history of banding together to elect only its candidates? First question. Second is the minority population cohesive enough that it will elect its candidates? And then I forget what the third one is. But basically, that's what you do. And you look to see what's the membership of the school board. You know, is it like a white majority school board when there's a black majority of the voters, not actually the students. So you look at the voters. And then in other places, like in Texas, for example, you look at Hispanic as well. Which reminds me, I know there's another question, but I've got to say this. I promised I would cover this. So when you look at ethnicity, we learned this because I think it was Matt Dameron who astutely in one of our meetings said, well, it doesn't add up to 100%. So what's going on here? And then we all wondered, we have to start over again? What's going on? Well, no. If you look, there's a column at the very end that says Hispanic of any race. Hispanic of any race. So like in the, if you go to the very first map, you see what would be called the 3rd district says 31.4%. That 31.4% is scattered across white, African American, Asian, and other races. And there are some kind of averages that people that put down Hispanic on the census. There's some general percentage of those who are white, African American, Asian, or other races, and you can go through and kind of roughly calculate what that would be. But this is the best data we have, so this is what we have on here. I just wanted you to understand why it doesn't equal 100%. Oh, I'm sorry, you were next. I thought you. Go ahead.
So my question is in regards to the factors for redistricting.
Yeah.
Are these the 4 that you looked at, the ones that you've already mentioned? This was how you guys, equality, compactness,
contiguity,
yeah, and the Voting Rights Act.
Well, and actually,
those were just the 4.
Well, and there was one more, and frankly, the Voting Rights Act applies, but we were not excluding things because they violated the Voting Rights Act. It just, we were all within the permissible band. But I would also add one more. Continuity is something that is not required by law, but that we try to consider. And so the input we'd already received is that this is not an opportunity for just a 3-year period to go and completely try something new. I mean, that could be done. That could be done at this stage, but sort of far be it from us, to 3 people, to sort of come up with a brand new idea and then give it to you. I mean, the brand new ideas ought to really come from the public at large. And that's what happens when you have a political body that drafts it. The brand new bodies come from a senator or a state representative who give it to the leadership and it works its way through the committee. But, I mean, there are an infinite number of brand new ideas that could be tried here. And
well, my question
Sure.
is in regards to, did you look at future forecasts? Because you've already admitted, as we found out Wednesday night's meeting, that this is based on 2010 census data. And so we know that the next census is in 2020. The next opportunity will be 2021. So we'll be with this for a couple of years. And so with a lot of reunification going on in Kansas City, people moving, I'm surprised that one of the factors was not the future trends, I would say, for like the next 10 years to be a factor into this redistricting, because there is going to be movement of people. And so I was just surprised that that was not a factor in how you look to redistrict the lines.
Well, we considered that actually at one of our initial meetings. And one problem is coming up with reliable data for where we stand at this moment, because remember that this map is not going to be with us for very long, because we're going to get the new census data in probably beginning of 2021. And at that point, new maps will be drawn. And so our thought was, let's not try to use our invariably imperfect estimates of what's happened over time, especially where we've got to have some reliable number, even if it was reliable in 2010, to do our equality of population. And what's going to happen is if you try to start roughly estimating where we think people have moved, we're probably going to make mistakes if we try to do an estimate for now. Now, I would say this, if the community wants to, within the parameters here of trying to keep equal population and the other things, if that might push you to one map or the other. So you might say, well, I don't like this map here because I don't really believe that the west side or whatever still looks like this. And it might push you to one map or another. But we did not try to come up with sort of an imperfect snapshot of where we are in this year. That was just our own considered judgment.
And I was just thinking, I'm sure the city would have that information, so I'm surprised that was not a factor. With all the development and with all the reunification taking place, a projection, I think, should have been a factor, that's all.
Okay. Go ahead.
In 2006, when the Great City Schools team came to Kansas City, they wrote a rather lengthy report that had a lot of influence. And the number one item on that list, which is usually the most important one, is the city needs to decide what it wants of the school district. And I started getting involved in 2009, so I've been through a couple of cycles. And frankly, what I see is not a political problem, it's a governance problem. We're very fortunate that over a series of votes that we have gotten a really, really high quality superintendent and board. But the fact is that they represent 12% of the people eligible to vote. And so from the standpoint of one, voter participation, and two, how many households actually are using the school district versus some other form of education, those factors seem to me to argue that thinking outside the box, if we created horizontal bands, 3 years from now, we'd just be moving the line up and down a little bit. But what we know is there's twice as many people downtown, or at least twice as many housing units, and it's pretty darn clear those are not reflecting a lot of environmental justice. And so when you go back to the Voting Rights Act, I don't think this is a mathematical exercise. I don't think it's an exercise in figuring out how to make it lawsuit-proof. It's really about how do we increase public participation in the governance of this district. When we have talent, we have to be able to hold on to it, and we can't hold on to it if there isn't that broad inclusion. So when I look at all of this, I'm not looking at it from the standpoint of just meeting the law. I'm saying, how do all of us in this room use it to go out and say, you have to get more involved in voting and participating? And so I hope that we can figure out a way to make that part of the consideration.
I've got that.
Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Hello. I have a couple questions, but I also want to say I moved here from a community, Denver Public Schools, where we went through a long process of moving from all at-large members to districts, and I know there's been discussion in this community, and that's because in Denver, only a small subset was getting to govern. And so when you had all at-large districts, it really wasn't fair. Huge chunks of people were being left out. So I agree with this lady over here that just because the map is drawn one way, it doesn't mean we're trying to exclude. It might mean we're trying to include and make sure that neighborhoods have a voice on the school board. If you dilute that district and cut it across one way, you could you could get the opposite of what your intention is, and I think that's really important. That said, what are the repercussions of this map? It doesn't seem to me that the way the sub-districts are drawn are a direct correlation with school attendance patterns. I don't think that matters, but I would like to find out that that's true. Partially because so many of our students attend signature schools. And so you may live in one district, as my children did. We lived in one district and attended school in a different sub-district. So I'm wondering, my first question is there any connection between the way sub-districts are drawn and attendance patterns? I believe the answer is no, but would you say that that is true?
Yeah, there's no pattern, no intentional pattern.
Okay.
That's exactly the kind of thing. Once we put these out there, that's exactly the kind of thing we would expect to hear from the community.
So if a district is drawn with truce being a border, which I understand what you're saying, but that really, by erasing that border for a sub-district, that may not get to the issue you're rightly raising. And I think it make it even worse to me. The other question I have is about representation of voters. As we heard last night, we've been hearing about half of the new elementary school students are going into charter schools. Are we trying to represent, and of course we know charter schools do not elect their boards if they have boards, so that's a whole different political problem, but are we trying to, what we still need to do is represent taxpayers equally in these districts. So whether or not they attend KCPS or not, they're taxpayers, and therefore we need to draw the lines to reflect and represent them in this district, even if they don't attend. Would you say that that is true?
Well, the law is voters,
Right.
even more than taxpayers. And so, yeah, I mean, people, we all pay substantial property taxes in, but we all vote. And, I think there just has to be a balance at some point. But I think what you've just said is an outline for hopefully a lot of detailed comments from people that maybe don't have kids in schools but have a stake in it.
Right, 'cause
and
they're
people that do
voters.
have kids in schools.
And then finally, I'm looking at populations that are growing, people that don't vote that need representation, particularly in the Hispanic community, undocumented people. We need to make sure that they're fairly represented and they lack political power. So those districts need to be drawn to make sure that they have fair representation, even though they don't have money and ability to run a strong campaign. You have to make sure that the district is drawn so that they're going to be fairly represented, even though they may not have people in that district who have a lot of money to run a big campaign. So that's right.
And one thing I'll say quickly, I've stepped back here not because I don't like standing up there, but I want to make sure we all have a chance to respond, because there's probably on some of these things where they've got better things to say than I do. So we're all going to answer now.
And my question is more about the process, because from what I'm hearing from people, I think there's a lot of people that have different ideas as to what these maps look like. So what happens if overall you get a huge amount of people that say, no, we don't like these, we like X? What will you do?
Well, our job is to convey that information to the Board of Elections. And the Board of Elections, at the end of the day, is going to have to make a decision about, let's say that the way the maps come out, we can't, we can only cover 2 of the 3 issues that you mentioned. And maybe on one issue, we haven't drawn the best map we could, but there's an irreconcilable conflict. Well, ultimately, that's the Board of Elections that makes that decision. And you can't vote the Board of Elections out. But you can, you can vote for a governor who will appoint Board of Elections members who you want, but that's the way our statutes are set up.
And I would just add to that. That we are operating on somewhat of a backstop timeline, right? We're talking about elections in April 2019, and so the idea, it may be tempting to say scrap all these, go back to the drawing board, but the reality is we have to have this done by August of 2018. Because candidate filing and other issues obviously impact the timeline. So just another consideration.
Sorry, one more thing I want to say. I know, but it may be that in the time that we have here, and given that this is just to cover, and for a couple years, we don't come up with a map that you like. But couldn't this be a great opportunity, a great warm-up to really come in when we get the 2020 data? Then we are going to have some more time. And so all is not lost if the map isn't ideal that is chosen this time around.
I have two questions, or one question, one suggestion. So the suggestion was that we were talking here, one of the things on the maps that would help us a little bit were street names of main thoroughfares. I don't know if that would be helpful to others. And possibly schools, and maybe high schools are ones that we are very visually aware of. We're a very visual society now, and so I do think you'll get better feedback, perhaps, on that. And zip codes was another one. I know that's a lot of asks, but anyway, just that's the way people visually identify where they are on a map. So that was just suggestions. And the other question I had, Eddie, was you had mentioned voters. So we all know there are those that are registered. Is it voters that are registered, or is turnout considered when you are putting these together?
Right. No, it's not. This is the residence data that you get from the census. Now, it's a matter of litigation right now, not here, about exactly what numbers you should use when you draw the districts, what's permissible, and then maybe what's required. If you have a lawsuit about this, they use a certain figure called CVAP, which is Citizen Voting Age Population. And they go through and figure that out based on race. But anyway, hopefully that answers your question.
I have a question. Right now, they're currently elected sub-districts. The people in that sub-district vote for that sub-district. These are now sub-districts elected at large, correct? Or are still in sub-district? 5 sub-districts, so you have only the people in that sub-district will vote for the people. So the people outside of that won't vote. It'll be like the current system is now, correct? Only for the 2 at large.
Hello, and my question is, and it might be more of a statement. I think, too, what the lady just said over there, to make sure non-voters get the ones that can't vote, whatever else, that's also for voters that don't trust right now. I'm going to just be honest. A whole lot of people don't think they don't want to vote. They not trust them because they feel like every time they try to vote, this happens. I mean, we can see what's going on as far as women, Like, I'm going to be honest, I love y'all, but I think she should have went first today. I'm just going to be honest. I mean, it's like we're just getting knocked, every time you look up. And then we keep on going back to the Constitution Amendment. My ancestors wasn't at the table when them things was wrote. I'm going to just be honest. I'm just keeping it real. I'm a Pullman Porter's daughter. So I think what it's about mainly is the trust. Like you just said, it seemed like, either way it go, by August 18, 2018, this West don't go down. But a lot of people wasn't even at the table, and then it's not even informative to the community. I'm Miss Resource Queen, but I can't get all the information to get to my community. So I think it's more about trust, and we should try to roll that way from here on out because it's so much stuff. They said it's already a 15-year plan, and it's supposed to be the 15-year plan that take place. My thing is, if you all don't do nothing else, please make sure it's about the kids. Make sure it's about even black leadership. Like they said, we got him here now. You know what I'm saying? We got it where stuff is working. I hope we don't mess up the wheel that's turning and it's working. So I hope you understand what I'm saying because I take it very emotionally and very seriously. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm over here speaking. Pop up. As I'm sitting here thinking, my mind is kind of bouncing between like this idealist perspective that I want to take and a realistic perspective that I want to take. So under the idealist, I think I would love to dream that our community could really rally around our neighborhood high schools, and maybe we have 4 current neighborhood high schools. Lincoln is a very prominent historical, long-standing, stable Lincoln High School. So what would the ideal boundaries look like? What do the voter numbers look like if the boundaries mimicked as close as possible to those 4 neighborhood, and then work in something around Lincoln, even though it doesn't have its own boundaries? And then with the thought that, maybe down the road, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, those graduates of those schools really feel united around those communities. And it's a long-standing feeder system that those students go on to become the leaders of the school board in the future. So that's my ideal. What would that map look like? Could we see that? And then my realistic side is saying, what's been the recent history? I would love to see the recent history, I'd say past 20 years, of the school board seats and the elections for those seats. How many candidates turned out? How many were write-ins for which district seats? And realistically, what in the next election this year, and then again, redrawing this 3 years from now, realistically, what candidates in the next 5 years, what communities are able to produce and historically have produced candidates that would fill those seats, how we would like them to be filled.
Yeah, those are all valid considerations. No. Well, this is an analog to arguments made with legislative districts. You'll find some regional important thing, like an important employer or something, and you'll say, okay, there ought to be a district that covers sort of this economic hub, and you'll try to draw around that. But then, of course, the other argument is, boy, we'd love to have 3 different districts touching that, because now you've got 3 people who care instead of just 1. And so, at the end of the day, there's no standard by which to judge that. It's just a prudential political decision.
Yeah, I just actually had a clarifying question, because I know it'll come up when I'm trying to explain this. But so we're going to go through this whole redistricting, and then we're going to have new elections, possibly a whole new board, although I really hope not. And then we have to do it again. Are we going to have to do the election again? We'll have a whole new board again in 3 years after that. So I think that it just kind of speaks to what kind of stability are we going to have, and how can we maintain that as best possible.
So one of the things, again, you all have note cards on your tables and pens, and it's really important that you write down what you think so that we can capture that for the record officially. But if it is important to you, what you just said, if it is important to you to maintain stability of the board, let's say that it sounds like you're of the opinion that the board functions really well, and you're pleased with the current superintendent, and so you would like to maintain some continuity of what we have now because it is favorable to you. So what you should do at that point is look at these 6 maps and see if there is a map that will lead you back to that you value. And so that would be the map that you prefer, because it will lead you to basically continuity of what we currently have, and that is permissible for you to want that. And so if you want that, we need to know that and write that down. And so we're also, you want me to talk? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Fierro.
Okay. I just wanted to remind everybody on the screens, those are the upcoming dates for further community outreach. I think this lady here made some good comments about ensuring that we include the community. And so my colleagues and I have worked with the Kansas City election boards to organize some upcoming opportunities for our parents and community to come. So those are listed on the screen. Also, in regards to the question about are we going to have to come back and vote again after the census, obviously the answer is yes, but I also want to point out that in April, what you are going to be voting on is that, again, we're going to go from 9 board members to 7. So districts, sub-districts 1, 3, and 5, when they are elected, will serve a 2-year term, along with one of the 2 at-large districts will serve a 2-year terms. Districts 2 and 4 and the second at-large seat would be elected to serve a 4-year term. So then when we come back for the next election cycle after the next redistricting, you will be voting each candidate in for a 4-year term. So I just wanted to point that out to everyone. Yes.
It was suggested by Ms. Lewis about a 30-day extension.
You're referring to what was decided the other night? Yes. Okay, yeah. I'll let Matt respond to that.
Sure, right. So the other night at the school board meeting, the school board passed a recommendation and a request for the election board to delay. So let's just take a step back and make sure everybody understands the process from this day going forward. You have in front of you 6 maps. As Eddie described, 3 of them are sort of distinct and stand alone. The other 3 are very comparable, and we consider them sort of a family of maps, if you will. They're also on the wall back there. Right, and the 3 distinct maps are on the left, then the 3 sort of family maps are on the right. So the initial plan was for the election board on May 17th to take those 6 maps and narrow it down to 3, sort of 3 finalists, and then we would spend the summer soliciting and accepting public comment on those 3 maps. And so you can see there on May 22nd and on June 4th, there are 2 public listening sessions, sort of sessions just like this, where we're going to let audience members weigh in on those 3 finalist maps. So at the school board meeting the other night, for those of you that were there, the school board recommended that the election board delay its consideration of the 6 maps and push that out. We conveyed that recommendation to the election board. They're not going to do that. So on May 17th, the election board is going to take these 6 maps and narrow it down to 3. And part of that is because I think they wanted as much public comment as possible on the final 3, so people actually knew sort of what was in play and what the real finalists were. I think they were also really concerned about the August deadline, that backstop date that we absolutely have to have this finished by. And so, like I said, we conveyed that to them. They're the decision makers. We're not. We conveyed that to them, and they declined to extend that out. So May 17th at noon, at the office of the Kansas City Election Board, which is in Union Station, they're going to hold a meeting where they're going to take the 6 that you have in front of you and narrow it down to 3.
Can we talk about the
May 17th, yeah.
the potential compromise, though, because we talked about adding some dates after this June 4th meeting so that we could have the 4 engagement sessions, since folks thought they were going to be seeing the maps on Wednesday. Okay.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So the other night we talked about maybe adding 1 or 2 more sessions after June 4th, and we're certainly open to that. We'll coordinate with the district to find a date that everybody thinks is effective for parents, that's effective for stakeholders. We consulted with the district on those 2 dates to make sure that the district thought that would be effective, and we're happy to find 1 or 2 more dates after June 4th to get even more public comment. Yes, ma'am.
You just go, you aren't going to get to talk. You can be there and observe, but you don't get to say anything.
My understanding is, and I don't want to make any commitments because I'm not the election board and I'm not the decision maker, my understanding is that they would accept public comment.
Okay. You're not going to have much time to figure them out, but you could make them. Right.
But that's also another reason we're really encouraging written feedback on the note cards that are on your tables. The email address here, KCPS-Redistricting@kceb.org. If you take these maps home and sort of digest them over the weekend and you're like, wow, this one's ridiculous, this one's great, send it in. And that way it's there. There's a record, you're on record as saying, this is what makes sense, this is what doesn't make sense.
And just so that you all know as well, this meeting is being recorded, so this is also public record that we will send on to the election board. So these comments will be taken into consideration as well.
Because I just have a concern, there aren't that many of us here. And even though we have this before next week, getting word out and...
If I could suggest one thing, just a thought that occurred. I remember that when they redistricted legislatively 10 years ago, many comments came in from the public to Jeff City. And many people, what their comment is they actually took a map and they drew their own lines on it. And obviously, I can't even do that because I can't use the software. It takes a long time. But, here's an idea. If you do send in written comments, maybe there's a way to scan in or somehow take a map and just draw the districts that you think make sense. I know they're not going to be equal in population because you've got to have the software, but that would be a nice way to visually convey what you're thinking and give a sense of your idea there.
If you don't have the maps, if you don't have the maps designated for the either zip codes or the schools that we'd recognize, there are people in my community who would not recognize that without that happening already. So, I mean, you know, I'll figure it out. But what about the community people that I'll be talking to? They need to see where we're talking, what we're talking about with the zip codes or whatever in there, please, so that I can take it back to my church or whatever. This will help us.
Yeah.
Is there any way that can be done for these existing maps? Is there any way that it can be done for these existing maps so that if we start to look at it, we have an idea? For instance, if I look at sub-district, start with 4 and remove 2, then if you look at 2 and it's going, District 5 is going more of an east-west, but where does that start? What does 805 represent in terms of a north-south border?
You know, here one idea is because, like right now, if you want to get on and look at a district for a state rep, you can really drill down to the street level, and sometimes they even divide.
Yeah.
Pretty. I wonder if we can't. Find a way to get a map with resolution that would let you do that. Obviously, when you print it out on 8.5 by 11, there's a limit. But maybe if there's a way, if they'll do this, we could get that on the internet at least with the schools and maybe the street and zip codes. Yeah.
I just want to say that the suggestion about the markers so that you can better read the map, we are going to make that request to the city planning department. That is who would be able to do that. They would if they can. And so we'll make that request on your behalf, and then we'll update the website, the Board of Elections website, and get those changes to KCPS as well if the planning department obliges.
And just for the sake of respecting and honoring everyone's time, we're going to start wrapping up. Please, if you have comments and haven't made them on these note cards, do so now. And Mr. Fierro is going to make a quick announcement as well.
Correct. Once again, I just wanted to say thank you to each of you who attended this morning. We greatly appreciate your input. I think the other night, it was maybe my colleague Patty Manzer, certainly was a very lively discussion, and I think she couched it as it's about civic engagement. And really, that is what it's about. Everybody's opinion this morning is very important. We need individuals to speak out, so thank you for doing that. I would just tell you that my colleagues and I are going to be assessing the maps just like each of you are, and look for an announcement on our website on Tuesday afternoon as to our assessment of these particular maps and what our message would be to the Kansas City Election Board on May 17th at noon.
And we will also email each of you, like we did to get you here to this meeting. We'll send a direct email so that you have all the information you need in preparation for Wednesday.
Let's, yes, ma'am.
The final decision lies with the current Board of Election members.
Okay.
That's the final decision.
Okay, thank you.
Let's give our consultants, Eddie Grime, Matt Dameron, Melissa Hasley, a round of applause. Thank you.
Jennifer Wolfsey is coming around to collect your feedback cards, so she's right here if you want to give them to her. She also has extras if you don't have enough on your table. Thank you all so much.